Let's continue reading Machiavelli. Machiavelli. During my last read, it was chapter 10. It was a briefly short chapter talking about two kinds of princes. One is those kind who have enough resources, a very powerful army to guard themselves against any attack from the outsiders. Those are quite no-brainers. Most of the time, they could really protect themselves. The prince would be able to maintain his power. The second type is those princes who didn't really have enough power, who don't really have power or opulence enough to really defend themselves against the outsider attacks. And most of the time, this sort of kingdom, this sort of princes, they have to hide and really retreat into their own castles, and then lock the door and use their ditches and walls to really guard against the attack from the outsiders. And Machiavelli said on surface this seemed dangerous, but however, if the prince is able to maintain the morale first of all, and also the outlook to show that the entire kingdom looks quite opulent, quite stable, and if a castle shows such kind of strength and fortitude to outsiders, then most of the time the outsiders would not dare to really attack. Even if they do, they most of the time they would end up failing miserably. And and yeah, that's pretty much. I don't fully comprehend this chapter. There seems to be some sort of ambiguity, but I'll just leave it there right now. And then during my last read, I briefly read about chapter 11 concerning a kind of principality which is very unique, ecclesiastical, definitely a religious, particularly Christianity kingdom. A kingdom or city or prince who maintains his power, who leads via religious power instead of the conventional political power. Although most of the time it is very, very hard to demarcate between religion and politics, they seem to be always conflating each other. For example, today Vatican City is unknown whether the Pope is a religious leader or a political leader. You may argue that he's both, and yeah, this is a kind of very unique prince, unique authority. So I'll continue reading. But being upheld by powers to which the human mind cannot reach, I shall speak no more of them, because being exalted and maintained by God, it would be the act of a presumptuous and rash man to discuss them. So even Machiavelli himself thought that he had absolutely no locus. He was not in a position to discuss any sort of ecclesiastical principality, because those principalities were mostly maintained by God, being elevated by God, being highly, yeah, glorified, granted by God. So let's see. I'll continue reading. Nevertheless, if anyone should ask of me how comes it that the church has attained such greatness in temporal power, seeing that from Alexander backwards the Italian potentates, not only those who have been called potentates, but every baron and lord, though the smallest, have valued the temporal power very slackly. Yet now a king of France trembles before it, and it has been able to drive him from Italy and to ruin the Venetians. Although this may be very manifest, it does not appear to me superfluous to recall it in some measure to memory. Before Charles, king of France, passed into Italy, this country was under the dominion of the Pope, the Venetians, the king of Naples, the Duke of Milan, and the Florentines. These potentates had two principal anxieties: the one that no foreigner should enter Italy under arms, the other that none of themselves should seize more territory. Those about whom there was the most anxiety were the Pope and the Venetians. To restrain the Venetians, the union of all the others was necessary, as it was for the defense of Ferrara. And to keep down the Pope, they made use of the barons of Rome, who being divided into two factions, Orsini and Colonnesi. These two families again. Previously, in a chapter regarding Cesare Borgia, Machiavelli had already talked about Orsini and Colonnesi. I'll continue. Had always a pretext for disorder, and standing with arms in their hands under the eyes of the pontiff, kept the pontificate weak and powerless. And although there might arise sometimes a courageous pope such as Sixtus, yet neither fortune nor wisdom could rid him of these annoyances. And the short life of a pope is also a cause of weakness, for in the 10 years, which is the average life of a pope, that's a really short. Every single pope could only live about 10 years. I think partly because almost every single pope was elected really, really old. He can with difficulty lower one of the factions, and if, so to speak, one people should almost destroy the Colonnesi, another would arise hostile to the Orsini, who would support their opponents, and yet would not have time to ruin the Orsini. This was the reason why the temporal powers of the Pope were little esteemed in Italy. Alexander VI arose afterwards, who of all the pontiffs that have never been showed how a pope with both money and arms was able to prevail, and through the instrumentality of the Duke Valentino, and by reason of the entry of the French, he brought about all those things which I have discussed above in the actions of the Duke. And although his intention was not to aggrandize the Church, but the Duke, nevertheless, what he did contributed to the greatness of the Church, which after his death and the ruin of the Duke, became the heir to all his labors. Pope Julius came afterwards and found the Church strong, possessing all the Romagna, the barons of Rome reduced to impotence, and through the chastisements of Alexander, the factions wiped out. He also found a way open to accumulate money in a manner such as had never been practiced before Alexander's time. Such things Julius not only followed but improved upon, and he intended to gain Bologna, to ruin the Venetians, and to drive the French off Italy. All of these enterprises prospered with him, and so much the more to his credit, inasmuch as he did everything to strengthen the Church and not any private person. He kept also the Orsini and Colonnesi factions within the bounds in which he found them, and although there was among them some mind to make disturbance, nevertheless he held two things firm: the greatness of the Church, with which he terrified them, and the other, not allowing them to have their own cardinals, who caused the disorders among them. For whenever these factions have their cardinals, they do not remain quiet for long, because cardinals foster the factions in Rome and out of it, and the barons are compelled to support them. And thus from the ambitions of prelates arise disorders and tumults among the barons. For these reasons, His Holiness Pope Leo found the pontificate most powerful, and it is to be hoped that if others made it great in arms, he will make it still greater and more venerated by his goodness and infinite other virtues. Chapter Chapter 12, How many kinds of soldiery there are, and concerning mercenaries. Having discoursed particularly on the characteristics of such principalities as in beginning I propose to discuss, and having considered in some degree the causes of their being good and bad, and having shown the methods by which many have sought to acquire them and to hold them, it now remains for me to discuss generally the means of offense and defense which belong to each of them. We have seen above how necessary it is for a prince to have his foundations well laid. Otherwise it follows of necessity he will go to ruin. The chief foundations of all states, new as well as old or composite, are good laws and good arms. And as there cannot be good laws where the state is not well armed, it follows that where they are well armed, they have good laws. I shall leave the laws out of the discussion and shall speak of the arms. I say therefore that the arms with which a prince defends his state I shall speak that the arms with which a prince defends his state are either his own or they are mercenaries, auxiliaries, or mixed. Mercenaries and auxiliaries are useless and dangerous. If one holds his state based on these arms, he will stand neither firm nor safe, for they are disunited, ambitious, and without discipline, unfaithful, valiant before friends, cowardly before enemies. They have neither the fear of God nor fidelity to man, and destruction is deferred only so long as the attack is. For in peace one is robbed by them, and in war by the enemy. The fact is they have no other attraction or reason for keeping the field than a trifle of stipend, which is not sufficient to make them willing to die for you. They are ready enough to be your soldiers, whilst you do not make war, but if war comes, they take themselves off and run from the foe, which I should have little trouble to prove, for the ruin of Italy has been caused by nothing else than by resting all her hopes for many years of mercenaries. And although they formerly made some display and appeared valiant among themselves, yet when the foreigners came they showed what they were. Thus it was that Charles, King of France, was allowed to seize Italy with chalk in hand. Oh, that's a very figurative and metaphorical phrase, with a chalk in hand. I'll continue. And he who told us that our sins were the cause of it told the truth, but they were not the sins he imagined, but those which I have related. And as they were sins of princes, it is a princess who have also suffered the penalty. I wish to demonstrate further the infelicity of these arms. The mercenary captains are either capable men or they are not. If they are, you cannot trust them because they always aspire to their own greatness, either by oppressing you who are their master or others contrary to your intentions. But if the captain is not skillful, you are ruined in the usual way. And if it be urged that whoever is armed will act in the same way, whether mercenary or not, I reply that when arms have to be resorted to, either by a prince or a republic, then the prince ought to go in person and perform the duty of a captain. The republic has to send its citizens, and when one is sent who does not return out satisfactorily, it ought to recall him, and when one is worthy, to hold him by the laws so that he does not leave the command. And experience has shown princes and republics single-handed making the greatest progress, and mercenaries doing nothing except damage, and it is more difficult to bring a republic armed with its own arms under the sway of one of its citizens than it is to bring one armed with foreign arms. Rome and Sparta stood for many ages armed and free. The Swiss are completely armed and quite free. Of ancient mercenaries, for example, there are the Carthaginians who were oppressed by the mercenary soldiers after the first war with the Romans, although the Carthaginians had their own citizens for captains. I'll stop here. This is a very, very ferocious polemic against the mercenaries. So basically, essentially, Machiavelli was vituperating the mercenaries a lot. I'll continue next chapter, next episode. See you. Goodbye.